Hi, this is Jack Stanley, and I wanted to sit down and talk about the good old days. Have you ever heard someone say that to you? I'm sure you have. God, don't you look back and wish you could live in the good old days? Would you? I wonder about that. When I think of, things that are going on, and looking at the world today, politically and socially and medically and financially and all the various things, well, I really want to live in the good old days. Well, let's think about this a little bit. Let's go back to our diet years ago. What did we eat? We ate a lot of bad things. There were no codes. It said there was nothing wrong with putting a little plaster Paris in milk. There was anything wrong with putting all kinds of interesting stuff in materials. It was interesting how they would sell anything and call it anything because it didn't matter. There were no rules, no regulations. Even bread was made of God knows what. And in that, they would throw in some plaster of Paris sometimes as well. And other things. It would be powder put in, alum, and all kinds of different things just to thicken up something and make it cheaper to make. Because you didn't know any different. You were poor. Most people were poor. Most people still are poor, but even poor people today can get more nourishment than most poor people hundreds of years ago. It's an interesting thing to think of, too, when you think about this. I mean, look at our medicine. Look at our health. Now, in the early days, go back to the Middle Ages, if you want to go back that far. I mean, there was nothing in the way of any kind of medical cures. And to be perfectly honest, in those days, if you got sick, probably the safest thing you could do was stay away from a doctor. Because they could kill you. Because they would bleed you and burn your skin and give you all kinds of things to clean you out and make you throw up constantly. This wasn't helping you. And I'd be willing to say that a good third of people who saw doctors when they were sick died because of the effects of the doctors in those days. We didn't understand medical science. I mean, it took a long time to figure out how you get circulation in the body. To understand, the Egyptians, go back then, what did they bury all of the mummies with? Their heart, because they considered the heart the seat of knowledge. And they would take out a hook and pull the brains out of the head because it was useless. That's why even on Valentine's Day, we still show hearts. That goes all the way back to the days of the Egyptians. But, think about this. Think of politics. Let's just use the United States. Let's go back to our earliest days in politics. Now, granted, we have a lot of nonsense going on in our political world right now. A lot of it is aided and abetted by the internet. The interesting thing is, years ago, there wasn't much to talk about with politics. I mean, you didn't see people. You didn't see your politicians. And if you did, it might be in a barbershop or a general store. They might be coming through town. No PA systems, no radio, no television. You could possibly have something like a newspaper that would be amazingly biased. You would have I'm just coming up with some names. I'm making them up. So just don't say that doesn't exist. I'm going to say the Massachusetts Federalist and the Pennsylvania Democrat. And basically, each one of these newspapers would only talk about how good the Democrats were, the Democratic Republicans in those days, how good they were and how terrible the Federalist was. Well, you can be sure that the Federalist newspaper talked about how good the Federalist was and how rotten the Democrats were. And when we formed our country, when we had our first formal meetings of our Senate and our Congress in New York City, which was our first capital, by the way, It was in Federal Hall, right on Wall Street. And the interesting thing is that, well, it was not that big a building. And so the Senate, which was a smaller group, went on to the second floor. And the House, which was larger, went to the first floor. Hence the names, the upper house and the lower house. That's how those terms came about. But they did not agree very well. In fact, after they started meeting in New York City, they got so angry at each other, they went to the fireplace, grabbed the fire irons, and started swinging them at each other. They were shooting each other. They were shooting at each other. There were duels fought. Look at Burr and Hamilton. Look at all the others. There were fist fights. In fact, there was one time somebody came in with a gun, and then everybody was practically packing heat in there. So it was a very different time. And it's an interesting thing. This was a few years later in Washington, D.C., and I think it was in the House. And I might be mistaken. But the interesting thing, well, it doesn't really matter where it was. It's just the event and how it happened. A brawl was not a rare thing in the early days. There were fights breaking out on the floor of the House, and I imagine in the Senate. And in one big fight, which there were several people involved, somebody grabbed another person by their hair to punch them, and they were wearing a wig, and everybody started laughing, and that ended that. But all the way up to, I think, like the late 50s, we've had fights in Congress. But they were very numerous years ago. And of course, politics was dirty, was nasty, and it didn't matter if you told the truth or lied. There were no rules or regulations, no Queensberry rules to these fights. Therefore, you could call your opponent anything. And your opponent could call you anything. And it didn't matter if it was true or false. It was said. It was said. I seem to be losing my voice a little bit here. But the interesting thing is this. Look at our health. I mean, going back to what I was saying years ago, don't go near the doctors, but I can remember when I was a kid, polio was still something. And lots of diseases that we really don't see today, are gone due to injections. And then I hear all these people saying, I don't want to get injections. It could kill me, and blah, 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 blah. Well, believe me, it's good for you, okay? And you know something? We have it so easy with injections. Our second president, John Adams, took a chance and had himself injected to protect himself from, I believe it was smallpox at the time, and had his whole family injected. Now, how did they inject an individual then? It's really terribly frightening. What they would do is they would go to someone with smallpox, take a knife that probably was not sterilized, cut open one of the sores from the smallpox, take that pus, go to you, cut a wound into you, and inject the pus with the knife. That was an injection. And you would get dreadfully ill, but then you would be immune to it. Now, the problem was, it wasn't always successful. It sometimes killed you. Not only the disease, but sometimes it would become infected and things like that. Nobody understood sterilization yet. We didn't understand sterilization. You think about it. We had a president that was assassinated, James A. Garfield, in 1881. Now, that's what, 139 years ago? It's not that long ago. And he was shot. And his doctors didn't believe in that fad called sterilization. And so they put dirty fingers, they put in probes, nothing clean. And what started as a minor wound ended up a festering infected mess. It was a little bullet hole that ended up to 11 inches of basically ghastly nonsense. And he eventually died of blood poisoning, killed by his doctors. And an interesting thing, his assassin, who was, loonier than a jaybird, he said the only sane thing at that time. He said, I didn't kill him. His doctors did. He was right. But they killed him anyway. But it was his attempt to kill him. He was a strange guy, by the way. He bought a fresh set of clothes, bought a new gun so it looked nice in a display case, because he knew it was going to be displayed. He was really, he was cup and saucer short of a full play setting, okay? Think of other things. We always talk about the good old days, how things were better. And some things were. But, years ago, I remember when I was a little boy living down south, there was segregation. I didn't quite understand it. But I heard my teacher use words that I wouldn't even repeat here. I heard the principal use words that I wouldn't repeat here. And we used to play games and use words that I would never repeat here or want to even use anywhere. But it's amazing. That's life. And it was an awful time. It was a very, very bad time down in the South for a while. And that's still something that's going on. And it's going to take a long time for it to be totally cured, if it ever does become totally cured. Food, we're all getting fat. We all have trouble with hearts and cancer and sugar, diabetes. Look at it. Look how many fat kids you have today. Take a look. Children are not supposed to be fat. But when you're gorging and eating all kinds of crap, you get fat. And you have kids that are 10 years old that are diabetics, type 2 diabetes. That's just beyond the pall. And if it was an isolated case, I'd say, well, that happens now and then, but it's not an isolated case. And the interesting thing is, we have all of our fast food. Food is just too available. That's the problem. Years ago, people didn't get a chance to eat as much, and they didn't want to eat as much because it wasn't the affair that it is today. Dinners used to be about conversation in many respects, and you would eat while you would converse, and you would say more than you would eat, probably. But today, in this day and age, things are very, very different, and we are in a dangerous spin, in a sense, because we have a tremendous amount of obese people in this country, and not just this country, all around the world. And it's interesting to note that, like China and Japan and Korea, countries that had very, very thin people, and they still do to a major point, but we started whipping in like McDonald's and all kinds of other, pizza places and this, that, and everything else. And now they have created fat farms in China for kids that are terribly fat, and they never were. But they're starting to eat a diet that's hurting us. We're pitifully out of shape. We have tremendous amounts of heart disease. We have a high rate of cancers. And basically, if you go back in time, you didn't have all that. You did not have lots of cancers. You did not have lots of heart issues. Now, in many cases, they didn't understand it, nor could they interpret what it is. I remember looking at an old dictionary years ago, and I looked up heart disease, and it said disease of the heart. So, that's as much as they really understood. And it wasn't until well into the 20th century that something came along that totally changed medicine. And that, of course, was penicillin. Penicillin didn't exist. We didn't have antibiotics. So if you got sick, if you got an infection, Hasta la vista. A lot of people died from things as innocuous as a common cold because there was nothing to fight it. And sometimes, they'd have old tales. They'd say eat moldy bread, which is actually very good because it's penicillin, basically. Even the Egyptians had stuff about that. Nobody understood why, but they understood it helped. But if I may say, the good old days, there were lots of interesting things, good things. The music was fascinating. We had ragtime and of course, waltzes, polkas. And then something in 1916 or so happened called jazz. And jazz really shook everything up because everybody hated it, at least everybody of a certain age. The kids thought it was grand. Now, how can I even suggest what what jazz was to the people of the late teens, early 20s? It was even spelled different. It was JASS originally, which in basic terminology of the day of musicians, Jason used to be getting it on. But jazz music, the best way I can describe it is the reaction was, in today's world, go to a senior citizen's home and bring a rap group. It won't go over well. And when jazz came out, everybody was screaming. They said it was unholy. It was the devil's music. And they said saxophones were never meant to do that. And John Philip Sousa wrote articles about how dreadful it was and how dangerous it was. And Thomas Edison, who was a good friend of John Philip Sousa's, they used to get together and just sit there and talk about how terrible jazz was. Now, jazz was here to stay. And then that led to more types of music. The whole thing is we hate change. That's part of the human animal. We really hate change. And, the thing is that that's what happened. The whole world went through a change, and music changed. We changed. And so just in closing here, because I've been rambling on a little bit here, but it's kind of fun to ramble on a little bit, just to chat and talk about stuff. And the thing is that, lastly, the good old days had their good points. And today has its good points. We may not like what we see in politics today, but believe me, they aren't swinging fire irons at each other. Now, there again, those days, they didn't have the internet. So, the internet is good and bad. And it'll be interesting to see how historians talk about this 100 years from now. It'll be fascinating. This is the information age. We went through the industrial age. What will follow the information age? That'll prove very interesting. So just think of all the various aspects, travel and, all kinds of stuff. You could do this for a month of Sundays comparing. But all in all, I'm happy I'm around when I'm around, because I'll tell you something. I've had some medical issues recently, and if I was living in 1850, I'd be dead, probably. And I'd be blind and suffering from some serious problems. So we're pretty lucky. So the good old days weren't so great, all of them. Some of them were. But I'm happy to be here today. What do you think? There's so much more to talk about. We could do like 5 things about this. And maybe I might add some stuff as I go along and talk about more things. Have a good day.